Okay, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about measurements. So before we go into the actual measurements, let's talk about just some basic terminology associated with measurements, specifically accuracy and precision. Okay, so this is something that usually you're interested in when you're doing like experiments. And so you're taking lots of measurements, maybe you're redoing experiments, doing multiple trials. And so then you want to think about the accuracy and precision of those measurements, of those repeated measurements, um, or even just, how your measurements relate to what you would actually expect or what it should be. So first off, accuracy. Accuracy is important. It is telling us how close this value is to the true value. So of course, this is something that we want, right? If we do a measurement, we want to get something that is accurate, something that is giving us a true indication, okay? Otherwise, we're wasting our time, right? So we want to get something that is correct or very close to correct. So when we're talking about measurements, it is important that we're getting accurate measurements. But that's not the only important thing. The precision of the measurement is also very important. The precision is telling you how close this measurement is to our other measurements. So we don't just, or typically we don't just measure things once, okay? Especially if it's something that's a little more unknown and we're really experimenting, we're going to do this lots of times, okay? Because you never know. Sometimes you can do an experiment or you can take these measurements and maybe you just messed up. You forgot to calibrate something or you just weren't very careful. And so sometimes you can take a measurement and it could be way off and you might, do it once and think, oh, well, that's that. And maybe you messed up and you're wrong and that's not good. Okay, so you tend to repeat things. And when you repeat them, then you compare those measurements and see how close they are to one another. Because ideally, if you keep measuring the same thing over and over, you should be getting the same result or very close, really. In reality, it should be very close. There's typically a little bit of deviation in those measurements, but it depends on the tool you're using, okay? And so how close all of those measured values of the same thing are tells you something about the precision. And so if all your measured values are very close together, then it's very precise, okay? And so the precision is telling us how reproducible it is, okay? So the accuracy is telling us how correct it is or how close to the true value it is, whereas precision is telling us how reproducible it is. And so sometimes this is easier if you can visualize it. Now you can look at numeric results and figure this stuff out, which is typically what you're doing in, say, a lab. But sometimes it's nice to just look at it visually. So if we just look at these targets and look at, well, if we were, aiming at this target, we're going to aim at the center, right? And so we're trying to hit the center of that target. And if we throw darts at this, say this is a dartboard and we're throwing darts, our goal is to get that center. And so we have 4 different scenarios here of 4 different times this is done. In the first one, the top left is showing a scenario where we not only have low accuracy because we're not hitting that center like we want, but also low precision because each trial, each time, we're hitting it a significantly different spot. Whereas that second one, upper right-hand corner, that scenario has pretty high accuracy, but low precision. So I say high accuracy because most of these things are hitting in the center. Now, not the very, very center, but pretty good, that second center ring. That's not bad. But it's all over the place, okay? So it's not always hitting kind of in the same place. Whereas then that bottom left, that's low accuracy, high precision. Low accuracy because again, we're not at the kind of center of that bullseye, but it has high precision because at least, even though we're off center, we're very consistent. We're always hitting that same spot. And so that's pretty good, because then once you realize you're very consistent, your technique's very good. You realize, well, I'm always off, upper right a little bit. And so then you can adjust to fix that, okay? Whereas that last scenario is the best, high accuracy and high precision. And so it's always kind of hitting the bullseye, very close together, almost always the same, and it's hitting that target, okay? Now in chemistry, usually when we talk about accuracy and precision, we're not talking about, hitting a bullseye. We're talking about numeric measurements. And so you would have to look at those numeric values. Usually we plot them to understand, to more visually see, are they close together? And whether or not, your measurements are accurate, the only way you can determine that is if you have some sort of standard to compare it to, which sometimes is the case and sometimes it's not. So sometimes you're measuring this thing that's already known, okay, and you're doing that to learn a technique or to understand something, and then you can compare it to the known value. Or you have something that is unknown and you're measuring it, and you measure it lots of times, and if you get very precise measurements, you hope that that means you are close to the correct value, okay? And so that terminology of accuracy and precision, relating those to measurements, is very important, especially in a laboratory type setting. That comes up a lot when you're trying to analyze data. Now let's just talk more specifically about just individual measurements. So if we're thinking about an individual measurement, and when we talk about measurements, we're talking about those quantitative things, so the numeric values, okay? If it's not something with a numeric value, we'd usually call it an observation, okay? So measurements, it's really important to realize measurement has two essential parts, okay? So it's not just a number, okay? It's very rarely, there's some things you can just talk about a number, but even though you might talk about just the number, there's always a unit. There's always some sort of unit. Even if you're counting something, it's that many of that thing, and that thing is the unit, okay? So if I have 5 pens, then pens is my unit, okay? So there's always, in any type of measurement, a number and a unit. And that unit is telling us the scale of things, okay? And so how large or small I'm talking about of this measurement, okay? So with units, there's not only different scales of things, but there's also different systems that we can use, okay? And so different systems of units, and when I say systems of units, I mean things like the English system. So English system, that's something that in America we use a lot. So just in everyday life when we measure things, like if you have a scale in your bathroom, you step on it, it tells you how many pounds you weigh, okay? Or even a kitchen scale. Usually you can toggle it between things like ounces, and then you can even toggle it to metric system. But those are type of English system units. So I've got examples of mass units, so like pounds and ounces, or volumes, gallons, temperature, Fahrenheit. And so those are a system that most people are very familiar with because you run across it in everyday life. But there are others that are more important for chemistry. So the metric system is mainly what we use. And so the metric system would be things like grams for mass, or liters for volume, or Kelvin, or even Celsius for temperature. And then those can all be scaled differently by putting prefixes on them, okay? And so that's where you see, instead of just the G for grams, you have mg for milligrams and kg for kilograms. And so that's just scaling the unit of grams larger and smaller by factors of 10, okay? And you can tack on those prefixes to any metric system unit, okay? And so that's mainly what we use when we measure things in chemistry. Now, there's kind of a little bit of a variation of the metric system, and that's the international system or the SI system. That's basically just narrowing down the metric system. So the metric system has these units and then tacks on all these prefixes so that you can utilize that unit for different scales of something. So it's useful to your application, your specific sample size. Whereas the international system, that's kind of standardized, picking a specific unit that if we're measuring mass, our standard unit is kilograms, and that's that. And that is kind of to make our equations very standardized, okay? So most of the time when there's an equation in chemistry, at least a complex equation in chemistry, if it involves mass, you have to plug in units in kilograms, okay? And if it has a volume, you have to plug it in meters cubed, or a temperature, you have to plug it in Kelvin, if it's a true SI equation, okay? And so that's going to be the more complicated equations, okay? But what we typically focus on in just general or intro type chemistry is the metric system, okay? So understanding those basic units of mass and volume and temperature, and even when we get to amounts, we talk about moles, all of those things, then we can scale them up and down using metric prefixes, okay? So you've got to, if you're going to work with chemistry, get used to the metric system, because that's most of the time what we would use, but not only be familiar with those metric units, but you've got to be familiar with the variations of all of the different prefixes and be able to convert between them. So let's talk just a little bit about metric prefixes, okay? So for metric prefixes, you can look up tables of them, but honestly, I think the tables that usually you find in books tend to confuse people and get used incorrectly. So I'm going to present it a little bit different than what you would find in a typical textbook. The way I like to think about it is in a way that should help you better understand the prefixes, okay? So the way I think about it is that we have prefixes that are for small things, okay? So things like, or the prefixes are deci and centi and milli and micro, nano, and pico, and it even goes further than that. Those prefixes, when they're tacked on to any base unit, so things like grams or liters, if you put one of these prefixes on there, now you're talking about something smaller than that base unit, okay? And all of these prefixes, we would abbreviate, okay? So we wouldn't write deci, we would use a lowercase d. We wouldn't write centi, we would write a lowercase c in front of whatever unit we're tacking it to, okay? And all of those small prefixes are associated with a specific scaling of 10, okay? Deci is related to 10 to the first, centi is related to 10 to the second, milli is related to 10 to the 3, and so on, okay? If you use it properly, which we'll talk about that in a minute. So we have those small prefixes, those things that relate to small things. And then we have some prefixes that relate to large things, okay? So deca and hecto and kilo and mega and giga and tera, and you can go on further, okay? But this is as far as we're going because this is usually good enough for just kind of an introduction in chemistry. And all of those prefixes also have associated abbreviations. So like kilo is a common one we use, and it's a lowercase k. Mega, that has a capital M, because you have to be careful. It's just like element symbols. Capitalization matters. Metric prefixes and even any unit, the capitalization matters, because sometimes simply changing between lowercase and capital letters can totally change what you're talking about. So you do have to be careful with that. Now notice then, these large prefixes also are all associated with a number, and all of those numbers are an exponent of 10, okay? But you have to be careful here. So the way I'm presenting it, then you have two things that relate to every number, right? Deci and deca both relate to 10 to the first. Centi and hecto both relate to 10 to the second. Milli and kilo both relate to 10 to the third. Okay, so initially that might seem confusing, but you have to tie that to the things being small or large, okay? And then that will help you apply it. And really, it'll reduce kind of how many individual little things you need to memorize. Because you could just say milli and kilo, I know are both 3. Micro and mega, I know are both 6. And then you just need to know, is it the small one or big one? And then you can utilize that to do conversions. Okay, I'm not going to do any conversions in this video, but I'm just going to tell you kind of how you would use this. Okay, do another video where I actually do some conversions. So the explanation of the way I'm presenting this is what I have designated on all of here is initially I tell you the name of the prefix, okay? And so that's just how you would say it when you're talking. And in parentheses is the actual abbreviation. So that's what you would write in front of the G for grams, or in front of the L for liters, and so on, okay? And then the number that I have, that's the exponent that you would put onto 10, okay, when you're trying to do conversions. And so let's see, for the small things, what you should think of is if this is small compared to my base unit, I should have a lot of them in one of the base unit, okay? So you can write all kinds of relationships from this relating these prefixes to a base unit by using this information. So I've got some examples there. So we know that the lowercase m, we know that the lowercase m is 3, right? And so also that's a small unit. And so that means that there should be 10 to the third of those in one of the base unit. Okay, so that's what I have here. Or that micro is 6, okay? And since micro is a small thing, there should be a lot of those in one of the base. So for instance, there could be 10 to the 6th microliters in a liter, okay? Whereas if I pick the same one, at least here, like the kilo, that's also 3. It's not 10 to the third kilo in one of the base unit, because kilo is a big thing, okay? So since kilo is the big thing, one of those would have a lot of the small thing. So it would have a lot of the base unit. So if I'm talking about kilograms, 1 kilogram, since it's big, would have a lot of grams. So 10 to the third grams. So kilo is associated with the 3, but you have to apply it right, okay? Whereas here I have giga, right? And that's associated with 9. And since giga is big, 1 gigasecond would relate to 10 to the 9th seconds. Now I just picked some random base units, grams and liters and seconds. You could use these same relationships to apply to any base unit with that same prefix. So if it's 10 to the third milligrams is 1 gram, it's also 10 to the third milliliters in 1 liter, and so on. Okay, so this is just one way to look at metric prefixes. Alternatively, you could use the typical tables that they give you in textbooks, where they give you negative exponents for all the small things, but you have to be careful there because those negative, all of those exponents then go with the base unit, not with the prefix. And then you also have to remember to actually type the negatives into the calculator when you do the calculation. So I just don't like to use negatives because I don't have to, okay? So what I'm saying is in a textbook, they will tell you that milli is 10 to the negative third. That's what they'll tell you. They won't tell you how to use it. They'll just say milli is 10 to the negative third. And so I say that 10 to the third milligrams is a gram. You could also say that 1 milligram is 10 to the negative third grams, okay? So that second way to write it, that's what the textbook is telling you, okay? And those are the same thing. Mathematically, they are exactly the same. And so both relationships are true. It's just, I think one is easier to think about than the other. But you could use either, and either would be correct. And so that's all for the basics. And like I said, I'm not going to do any calculations on this video. I'll do them on another video. And so you can go to that if you wanted to as well.